While washing dishes, I got a call from my landlord. Did you unplug the extension cord in the basement? You know that feeling when your entire world just implodes? When one minute you're just doing something mundane, drying your hands, and the next you're staring into the eyes of someone utterly broken, someone accusing you of murder. That's exactly where I found myself, utterly lost and terrified. It was late, around 11 p.m., and I'd just finished laundry. My landlord, Casper, suddenly appeared, his knees buckling, hitting his head against the wall repeatedly. Whoa, Casper, what's wrong? It's just an extension cord. I tried to reach for him to stop him, but he shoved me back with a surprising desperate force. His hand shook as he fumbled for his phone, whispering, "She's gone." 11:23 p.m. Just like they warned him. Tears streamed down his face as he spoke into the phone, confirming it. Yes, the power was cut. 12 minutes. That's all it took. Before I could even process what was happening, the basement door flew open and Mrs. Delacroix from the unit below mine came charging up. She took one look at me, her eyes wild, and screamed, "Murderer!" so loud my ears rang. My back hit the kitchen counter, completely lost. She collapsed next to Casper, both of them sobbing. 47 days, she wailed. We kept her alive for 47 days, and you killed her in 12 minutes. Kept who alive? What's happening? My phone started blowing up with texts. Monster, how could you? We all heard what you did. Cops are coming. Then Tiago, the building's maintenance guy, burst through my door, wrench in hand. You sick bastard. I told Casper not to rent to outsiders. He looked at me in disbelief. The orange cord? The one that runs up through the PVC pipe that we all check 3 times a day. It was just an extension cord. My voice cracked with panic. Mrs. Delacroix laughed, a raw, hysterical sound. Just an extension cord? That cord was the only thing between her and death. Casper finally looked at me, his eyes red and swollen. 2 weeks. You've been here 2 weeks and you've destroyed everything. I explained the basement rules when you moved in. I showed you the locked cabinet, the medical equipment. He was shaking with rage. You showed me where the laundry was, I pleaded, desperate now. That's it. There was no locked cabinet. More people started flooding into my apartment, the couple from 3C, the old man from the first floor, even the food delivery drivers. They all looked at me with pure hatred. I delivered her medications just yesterday, the pharmacy tech said quietly. $12,000 worth. All useless now. She trusted us. Someone else choked out. We had shifts. 24/7 monitoring until you came. Mrs. Delacroix pulled out her phone, showing a schedule. Look, your name isn't even on the care rotation because you refused to help when we asked. What care rotation? Nobody asked me anything. Sirens wailed outside. Through my window I saw 3 police cars and an ambulance pull up, but the EMTs moved slowly, like they already knew it was too late. 11:23, Casper kept repeating. The machines would have alarmed at 11:11 when the power cut. She had 12 minutes of battery backup. 12 minutes of oxygen left. My stomach turned to ice. The humming, someone whispered. He must have heard the machines humming through the ceiling. How could he not know? We were so close. Mrs. Delacroix wept. The lung transplant was next week. She just needed 1 more week. 2 police officers entered my apartment. One already had handcuffs out. Ma'am, we need you to come with us. I didn't know. I pleaded. There was no sign on the cord. No explanation. How was I supposed to know someone's life support was plugged into a random orange extension cord? Casper's face turned dark. That extension cord ran up through the ceiling to Mrs. Antonoff's apartment. Her granddaughter, Vera, 7 years old with cystic fibrosis. Her ventilator, her oxygen concentrator, her feeding pump. Everything that kept her alive was plugged into that cord. The power went out at 11:11 when you unplugged it. The backup battery only lasts 12 minutes. At 11:23 p.m., her ventilator stopped. She suffocated in her sleep while her grandmother was in the bathroom. A little girl is dead because you unplugged an extension cord to do your laundry. Tiago spat. I was sobbing now too. But there was no sign, nothing saying it was medical equipment. The officer stepped forward. You're under arrest for involuntary manslaughter. The cold metal clicked around my wrists as he read something about rights, but my ears were ringing too loud to hear. My legs turned to water, and I would have fallen if the second officer hadn't grabbed my arm. The crowd of tenants pressed closer as we moved toward my door. Mrs. Delqua spat at my feet. Tiago raised his wrench. The couple from 3C took pictures with their phones. The old man just stared with empty eyes. My knees buckled on the first step and the officer had to basically drag me down. Each step felt like walking through mud. More people lined the hallway and lobby. The pharmacy tech shook his head slowly. Someone threw a wadded paper at me. The police car sat right outside, lights flashing. The officer pushed my head down as I got in the back seat. Through the window, I saw Casper collapse against the building wall. The drive to the station took 20 minutes but felt like hours. The handcuffs dug into my wrist with every bump. They brought me through a side door into a room with bright lights and cameras. A woman in uniform rolled my fingers one by one onto an ink pad. She grabbed my chin, turning my face left then right for photos. I tried to tell her about the cord, how nobody warned me, but she just kept working. Another officer asked for my jewelry and shoelaces. My hands shook so bad I couldn't get my earrings out. The booking officer typed on his computer without looking up. They asked about medical conditions, allergies, emergency contacts. I gave them Gabriella's number through hiccups and sobs. They told me I got one phone call. The payphone on the wall was sticky and smelled like old cigarettes. My fingers kept hitting wrong numbers. Finally I heard ringing, but Gabriella didn't answer. Her voicemail kicked in and I tried to talk, but only managed to say her name, "Please help," and "lawyer" before the time ran out. A female officer led me down a hallway that smelled like bleach and urine. The holding cell had 3 other women inside. One was sleeping on the floor. Another rocked back and forth on the bench. The third just stared at the wall. I sat on the metal bench, pulling my knees to my chest. The lights above buzzed and flickered. My brain kept replaying the moment I unplugged that orange cord. Just 12 minutes. That's all it took for a little girl to die. The woman who was rocking started yelling at invisible people. The one on the floor rolled over and threw up. Hours passed with nothing but that buzzing light and the smell of vomit. My back hurt from the metal bench. My throat was raw from crying. Around 4 in the morning, a guard banged on the bars and said I had a visitor. He led me to a small room with a table and 2 chairs. A man in a wrinkled suit sat there with a yellow legal pad. He introduced himself as Reed Carpenter from the public defender's office. His eyes were red. He kept yawning. He explained I'd see a judge in a few hours for arraignment. The charge was involuntary manslaughter, and bail would probably be high because a child died. My stomach dropped like I was falling. He asked me to explain exactly what happened. I told him about doing laundry, the orange cord, how it just looked like any other extension cord. I explained that Casper only showed me where the washers were, and never mentioned medical equipment. Reed wrote notes and frowned when I said nobody warned me. He said we'd need proof. He asked if I'd ever been arrested or had a criminal record. I shook my head. He said that would help, but the prosecutor would focus on the victim's age. He gave me his card and said he'd see me in court. Back in the holding cell, I tried to sleep but couldn't stop shaking. The arraignment was at 10 a.m. They brought us orange jumpsuits to change into. Mine was too big and smelled like sweat. They chained us together to walk to the courthouse. The courtroom was full. I saw some tenants from my building in the gallery. The prosecutor was a woman named Ivy Stevens with perfect hair and a black suit. She stood up and described how my reckless actions caused a child's death, using words like negligent, careless, and preventable. The judge looked at me over his glasses while she talked. When it was Reed's turn, he mentioned my clean record and stable employment. The judge set bail at $50,000. My legs almost gave out again. Reed said something about payment plans and bail bondsmen. The guard started leading me back to holding when I saw Gabriella at the back of the courtroom. She pressed against the glass and mouthed that she'd figure it out. Seeing her face broke something inside me. I sobbed so hard the guard had to hold me up. Back in the cell, I curled into a ball and waited. Hours passed. The woman who'd been yelling was gone. 2 new women were brought in. One of them recognized me from the news. She called me baby killer, until the guard told her to shut up. Finally, around 3 p.m., they called my name for release. Gabriella had somehow gotten the money together. The release process involved more paperwork and getting my belongings back. My phone was dead. My shoelaces were tangled. They gave me a court date and a list of bail conditions. No contact with the building tenants, can't leave the state, weekly check-ins. When I finally walked out the front door, Gabriella's car was running at the curb. She hugged me so tight I couldn't breathe. We drove for an hour to her apartment because I couldn't go home. The building management had already started eviction proceedings. She grabbed some of my clothes before they changed the locks. I sat in her passenger seat scrolling through my phone once it charged. Dozens of messages, voicemails, texts calling me murderer and monster and baby killer. News articles with my booking photo. Comments from strangers saying I should die. My work email said I was suspended pending investigation. My hands wouldn't stop shaking as I deleted message after message. The next morning my phone rang while I was staring at Gabriella's ceiling, unable to sleep. Reed's tired voice explained the prosecutor was moving forward with involuntary manslaughter charges. 5 years maximum prison time. My whole body went cold. He listed my bail conditions like reading a grocery list. No contact with building tenants, surrender my passport within 48 hours, weekly check-ins at the courthouse every Friday. I wrote it all down on the back of an envelope with a shaking hand. 20 minutes later my boss texted, "Suspended without pay. Effective immediately pending case outcome." I showed Gabriella the message and watched her face harden. She grabbed her laptop and started searching for defense attorneys. Even though we both knew I couldn't afford anyone better than Reed, she typed names into Google and read reviews out loud. Criminal defense fees started at $10,000. Some wanted $50,000 upfront. My savings account had $3,000. An unknown number texted me a photo while Gabriella searched. A schedule grid filled with tenant names and time slots, care rotation schedule across the top. My name wasn't anywhere on it. The message underneath said I refused to help when asked because I was too busy. I stared at the screen trying to remember anyone asking me about anything. Nothing. No memory of any conversation about caring for anyone. I showed Gabriella and she screenshotted it immediately. Reed called back that afternoon with copies of the initial police reports. 6 tenants claimed they personally told me about Vera's condition. Mrs. Delqua said she explained everything my second day. Tiago claimed he warned me about the court specifically. The couple from 3C said they asked me to join the care rotation. But when Reed pressed for details, their stories fell apart. Nobody could say exactly when these conversations happened. No specific dates or times. One said morning, another said evening, one said in the hallway, another said by the mailboxes. Reed said the inconsistencies helped our case, but the prosecutor wouldn't care. That night I couldn't close my eyes without seeing the orange cord. Every time I started to drift off, I imagined Vera trying to breathe, her small lungs working harder and harder as the oxygen ran out, the ventilator alarm beeping in an empty room. I got up to use the bathroom and my legs gave out. Gabriella found me on her bathroom floor at 3 a.m. I was sobbing so hard I couldn't speak. She held me while I kept saying I killed a child over and over. She didn't tell me it wasn't true. She just held me tighter. 3 days after my arrest, Gabriella found a defense attorney named Miriam Ellis. She specialized in negligence cases and agreed to meet us after hearing the basic facts. Her office was in a strip mall between a nail salon and a tax place. She listened to my whole story without interrupting. When I finished, she asked one question. Why was life support equipment plugged into an extension cord in a shared basement? I didn't have an answer. She took my case for $8,000, which Gabriella put on 2 credit cards. Miriam immediately filed requests for building records and permits. Within a week, she discovered the building had 0 permits for medical equipment installation. The electrical setup violated 7 city codes. She explained this didn't erase what I did, but showed a pattern of negligence beyond just my actions. The preliminary hearing was scheduled 2 weeks later. I threw up twice that morning from nerves. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Ivy Stevens stood at the prosecutor's table, looking perfect in her black suit. She played the 911 call as her first piece of evidence. Mrs. Antonoff's voice filled the room, begging for help, telling the operator her granddaughter wasn't breathing. The dispatcher asking if she knew CPR. Mrs. Antonoff crying that the machine stopped working. Everyone in the gallery was crying. The judge was wiping his eyes. I was sobbing so hard Miriam had to hold me up. The medical examiner, Ernest Platt, took the stand next. He explained in simple terms how Vera's ventilator stopped exactly 12 minutes after losing power. How her damaged lungs couldn't function without mechanical help. How she would have lived if the power hadn't been cut. He showed a timeline chart. 11:11 p.m., power cut. 11:23 p.m., respiratory failure. Death confirmed at 11:47 p.m., after resuscitation attempts failed. I ran out of the courtroom and threw up in the hallway trash can. The bailiff followed me out but didn't say anything, just handed me a tissue and waited for me to come back inside. Miriam spent the rest of the hearing filing motions for records. She wanted all building inspection reports from the last 5 years, all correspondence between Casper and city officials about permits, all emails about the medical equipment installation. The judge granted every request. 2 days later, Miriam called with the results. 6 months ago, Casper applied for permits to install proper medical power systems. The city denied his application because the building's main electrical panel couldn't handle the load. Instead of upgrading the panel, Casper ran an extension cord through the basement ceiling. He never told the city, never got approval, never posted warnings. The email showed he knew it was dangerous but did it anyway to save money. A week later, a detective named Barry McCoy knocked on Gabriella's door around 9 a.m. He wasn't there about my criminal case, but about building code violations at my old apartment. He sat at Gabriella's kitchen table with a notebook and asked me to walk through exactly what Casper showed me when I moved in, 2 weeks before everything happened. I told him Casper met me at the front door with my keys and took me straight down to the basement to show me where the washers and dryers were. The whole tour lasted maybe 5 minutes, and he never mentioned any medical equipment or special electrical needs or anything about a sick child upstairs. Barry wrote everything down and asked if Casper gave me any papers about basement rules or safety procedures. I shook my head and explained I just got the standard lease and a sheet about trash pickup days. He asked me 3 more times if I was absolutely sure Casper never mentioned the orange cord or warned me about touching anything in the basement. Each time I told him the same thing because it was the truth. The next morning, Gabriella woke me up to show me the local news on her laptop. A reporter named Ariella Brandt was standing outside our building doing a live report about the tragedy. She called it a preventable death, and said sources told her the new tenant who caused it was staying with family nearby. Within an hour, Ariella and her camera guy were parked outside Gabriella's apartment building. We watched from the window as she knocked on doors trying to find someone who would talk about me. Gabriella had to call in sick to work because we couldn't leave without walking past the news van. I started wearing sunglasses and one of Gabriella's baseball caps whenever we had to go anywhere. We used the back entrance by the dumpsters and took different routes to avoid being followed. Ariella left business cards under our door every day for a week asking for my side of the story. Miriam called that afternoon saying she got something important from the building security company. She had requested all footage from my move-in day, 2 weeks before Vera died. The lobby camera showed everything clearly from when Casper met me at 11 that morning. We watched it together in her office. The timestamp showed Casper leading me inside and walking straight to the basement door. 4 minutes and 37 seconds later, we came back up and he handed me my keys. That was it. No tour of the building, no introduction to other tenants, no safety briefing about medical equipment. Miriam made 3 copies of the video and filed one with the court. While reviewing tenant statements, Miriam discovered something that made her slam her hand on her desk. 3 months before I moved in, another tenant had accidentally knocked the same orange cord loose while moving boxes in the basement. But that tenant heard alarms going off upstairs and immediately plugged it back in. The building manager added that tenant to the care rotation the very next day to make sure it never happened again. But nobody thought to put up a sign or warn new residents or do anything to prevent it from happening again. Miriam scheduled a meeting with an electrical inspector named Abram Kerr to examine the basement setup. I went with them even though being back in that building made me feel sick. Abram spent 2 hours taking photos and measurements of the orange extension cord that ran up through a PVC pipe in the ceiling. He traced where it went and shook his head the whole time. He wrote a 12-page report calling the setup criminally negligent building management. He said running life support equipment through an unmarked extension cord in a common area violated every safety code he could think of. He took photos showing there were no warning signs, no labels, nothing to indicate the cord was anything other than regular basement wiring. His report said any reasonable person would assume it was just a random extension cord. The pharmacy tech who used to deliver Vera's medications contacted Miriam through the prosecutor's office. He agreed to give a statement about how the building operated. He sat in Miriam's conference room and explained he'd been delivering to the building for 8 months. He said everyone who lived there knew about Vera except for me because I was too new. He confirmed the whole system relied on word-of-mouth communication with no formal procedures or written warnings. He said he'd asked Casper once why the medical equipment wasn't properly wired, and Casper told him it was temporary until he could afford to upgrade the electrical panel. 2 days later, Miriam had me come to her office to listen to the complete 911 call from that night. I didn't want to hear it, but she said I needed to understand the full timeline. Mrs. Antonoff's voice started calm, but got more and more panicked as she explained Vera wasn't breathing. The EMTs arrived at 11:31 p.m. According to the dispatch audio, we could hear them working on Vera for 20 minutes trying to bring her back. The medical examiner pronounced her dead at 11:47 p.m. I realized I was already back in my apartment by then, completely unaware that a little girl was dying 1 floor above me. Miriam pulled out a legal pad and we spent 3 hours creating a detailed timeline of that night. My laundry receipts from my pocket showed I started a load at 10:45 p.m. The power cut happened at 11:11 p.m. According to the building's electrical logs that Miriam subpoenaed, I was in the basement until about 11:15 p.m. when I gave up and went back upstairs. The timeline proved the 12-minute battery backup was completely insufficient for life-critical medical equipment. Miriam emphasized that any proper medical setup would have hours of battery backup, not minutes. She found my lease agreement in her files and compared it to other tenants' leases that the prosecutor had submitted as evidence. Their leases had an addendum about basement rules and medical equipment that required a signature. My lease didn't have that addendum at all. Casper claimed in his statement that he gave me the addendum, but his own record showed he never got my signature on it. The property management company's files had signature pages for every other tenant except me. Detective McCoy interviewed Tiago the next week, and the transcript was fascinating. Tiago initially insisted he'd warned me about the cord the day after I moved in. But when McCoy pressed him for specific details about when and where this conversation happened, Tiago's story started falling apart. First he said it was in the hallway. Then he said by the mailboxes. Finally, he admitted he only told me not to touch stuff that wasn't mine, without explaining why anything mattered. McCoy asked him directly if he ever used the words equipment, or life support, or sick child. Tiago admitted he hadn't. The city inspector came to the building 3 days later with a thick clipboard and spent 4 hours checking everything. He found exposed wires hanging from the ceiling in 2 spots in junction boxes without covers in the basement. He took photos of the orange cord running through the PVC pipe, and shook his head every few seconds while writing notes. He tested outlets that sparked when he plugged in his meter, and found circuits pulling way more power than they should. His final report listed 7 major violations, including the exposed wiring and overloaded circuits that could have started a fire any day. The worst part was where he wrote that the makeshift medical setup endangered all residents, especially the patient, because there were no proper safeguards or backup systems. Miriam called me 2 weeks later, while I was at Gabriella's apartment looking for jobs online. Ivy Stevens wants to meet about a plea deal, she said. I drove to her office that afternoon and sat across from both lawyers at the conference table. Ivy pushed a paper across to me that said I would plead guilty to involuntary manslaughter, and she would recommend 2 years probation to the judge. No jail time? I asked. She nodded, but Miriam grabbed my arm before I could say anything else. We need to discuss this privately, Miriam said. After Ivy left, Miriam explained that accepting meant admitting full responsibility when the evidence showed so many other failures. But no prison, I said. She looked me straight in the eye and told me she believed we could show my actions happened because of criminal negligence by others, not just my mistake. I spent 3 sleepless nights thinking about it, weighing prison risk against admitting to something that felt only partly my fault. I called Miriam on the 4th morning and told her to reject the deal. I can't say I'm fully guilty when nobody warned me, I said. She said she understood and would inform the prosecutor. The next week, Miriam got copies of Vera's hospital discharge papers through Discovery. The documents showed the hospital's discharge team specifically recommended installing a proper generator system with automatic transfer switches for her equipment. They also recommended visual and audible alarms on every piece of equipment to alert caregivers if power failed. Casper had signed the papers acknowledging these recommendations 6 months before I moved in. Instead of following them, he ran that orange extension cord through the basement ceiling to save money on electrical work. 2 tenants contacted Miriam's office after seeing news coverage about the case. They both lived in the building for over a year, but said nobody formally told them about the cord either. One found out when she saw Mrs. Delcroix checking it during laundry. The other learned when the pharmacy tech mentioned it during a delivery. Both signed statements saying the building operated on casual communication, with no official system for informing residents about critical safety issues. Their statements directly contradicted the prosecution's claim that everyone knew about the life support system. The nightmares started around this time, always the same. I would hear ventilator alarms going off somewhere, but couldn't find where they were coming from. I'd run through endless hallways looking for the source while the beeping got louder and more urgent. I'd wake up soaked in sweat, sometimes screaming, which scared Gabriella. She found a therapist who specialized in trauma. The therapist charged $150 per session, which I could barely afford with no job, but Gabriella helped cover half. 3 mornings later, Gabriella went out to her car for work and found something under her windshield. It was a school photo of Vera, a little girl with brown hair and a huge smile, with murderer written across it in red marker. We called the police, but the officer said without cameras they couldn't do much. Anonymous letters started arriving at Gabriella's apartment addressed to me, calling me a child killer, and saying I deserved to die. Someone created a Facebook page called Justice for Vera, with my photo and details about where I was staying. We had to change Gabriella's locks after finding scratches around the keyhole. One night, Miriam arranged for another expert to examine the basement since the city inspector's report focused on code violations, not the specific cord issue. Raymond Sands arrived with cameras and measuring equipment, spending 6 hours documenting everything. He traced the cord's path from the basement through the ceiling, taking photos every few feet. He checked for any signs, labels, warnings, or markings that might indicate the cord's purpose. His report confirmed there was absolutely nothing to show the orange cord powered anything important. He photographed the outlet where it plugged in, showing it looked exactly like every other outlet in the basement. He measured the cord's visibility and found it was partially hidden behind pipes for most of its run. He concluded any reasonable person would assume it was random wiring, not life support. Ernest Platt sent his final autopsy report to both legal teams a month after Vera's death. The report went into detail about her lungs, describing extensive scarring and damage from years of cystic fibrosis. He noted her lung function was below 20% even with the ventilator support. While he confirmed she would have survived that specific night with power, he also wrote that her condition was terminal without the transplant scheduled for the following week. Reading his clinical description of how her lungs looked made me run to the bathroom and throw up. The transplant team's letter arrived at Miriam's office 2 days later, confirming what everyone already knew, but seeing it in writing hit different. Vera was scheduled for double lung transplant surgery in 6 days from when she died. The letter explained how rare pediatric lungs were, and how long she'd waited for a match. Those same lungs went to another child the day after Vera died, someone who was probably alive now because Vera wasn't. I sat in Miriam's office staring at that letter, feeling sick knowing she was that close to getting new lungs, that close to having a chance at a normal life. Miriam took the letter from my shaking hands and placed it in a thick folder marked Defense Evidence, before pulling out another stack of papers. She'd been working on a motion to dismiss for the past week, typing late into the night according to her assistant, and now she was ready to file it with the court. The motion argued that Casper's negligence in maintaining the building and his failure to properly mark life-saving equipment was the real cause of Vera's death, not my action of unplugging an unmarked cord. She drove us to the courthouse that afternoon where she filed the 20-page document with the clerk who stamped it, and gave us a hearing date 3 weeks out. The judge wouldn't dismiss the charges when we finally got our hearing, but he did acknowledge on the record that the building's numerous code violations and lack of proper safety measures contributed significantly to the tragedy. After the hearing, Detective McCoy caught up with Miriam in the courthouse hallway while I was in the bathroom. When I came back, she told me he'd said something important off the record. He'd investigated hundreds of cases in his career, but he'd never seen such dangerous negligence in a building with a medically fragile child. And while he couldn't say it officially, he believed the real crime was Casper's cost-cutting measures that created this death trap. That night at Gabriella's apartment, I sat at her kitchen table with a notebook and pen, writing page after page of apology to Mrs. Antonoff. I explained how I just moved in 2 weeks before, how nobody ever told me about Vera or the medical equipment, how I would have never touched that cord if I'd known a child's life depended on it. The letter went on for 6 pages, tears dropping onto the paper and smudging the ink. But when I showed it to Miriam the next morning, she shook her head and put it in her desk drawer. Any contact with the victim's family could violate your bail conditions, she explained, and the prosecution would use it as evidence of guilt if they found out about it. Meanwhile, Ivy Stevens was busy interviewing more tenants from the building. But when Miriam got copies of their statements through Discovery, she found major problems with their timeline. The timestamp showed several tenants claimed they warned me about the cord on dates when I wasn't even home, according to my work schedule and credit card records. 3 of them admitted under follow-up questioning that they might be confusing me with previous tenants they'd warned over the months, since people moved in and out of the building regularly. Miriam also got the lobby security footage from the week before Vera's death, which showed something we hadn't expected. The grainy video captured other tenants confronting me multiple times in the lobby, with one woman pointing her finger in my face and a man blocking my path to the elevator. Though there was no audio, Miriam hired a lip reader who confirmed they were calling me unfriendly and antisocial because I hadn't attended their building potluck dinner. This harassment, Miriam argued in a supplemental filing, explained why the tenants might not have included me in important building communications about the medical equipment. The news about Casper came through official channels a week later, when the city attorney's office held a press conference announcing criminal charges against him for building code violations and child endangerment. They'd found 17 separate violations that put residents at risk, including the illegal medical equipment setup that directly contributed to Vera's death. This separate criminal case against Casper strengthened our argument about systemic failures, and Miriam immediately incorporated it into our defense strategy. 2 days after Casper's charges were announced, Ivy Stevens called Miriam with a revised plea offer. Instead of involuntary manslaughter with potential prison time, she was now offering misdemeanor negligent endangerment with 2 years probation and 200 hours of community service. Miriam thought this was recognition that their case had serious weaknesses, especially with Casper now facing his own criminal charges, and she advised me to seriously consider accepting it. I needed to understand the medical aspects better before making any decision. So Miriam arranged a meeting with Ernest Platt at his office downtown. He spent 2 hours explaining exactly what happened that night, showing me diagrams of how ventilators work and what happens when they lose power. Proper labeling and redundant alarm systems could have prevented this tragedy, he told me, and he'd seen similar deaths from communication failures in hospitals that didn't follow safety protocols. He couldn't officially blame the building management in his report, but he made it clear that Vera's death was preventable if proper procedures had been in place. The decision about the plea deal kept me awake for weeks, pacing Gabriella's living room at 3 a.m. while she tried to convince me to get some sleep. Taking the deal meant accepting responsibility for something I didn't know I was doing. But going to trial meant risking years in prison if the jury sided with the grieving grandmother. Miriam laid out the risks clearly in meeting after meeting, showing me statistics about conviction rates and sentencing guidelines until finally I couldn't take the uncertainty anymore. I decided to accept the misdemeanor plea to avoid trial and the risk of prison, though nothing about this decision felt right. Miriam said it was the smart choice given the circumstances, that juries were unpredictable when children were involved, but smart and right felt like completely different things. We spent the next 3 days preparing my statement for the plea hearing, where I'd have to stand in front of the judge and acknowledge my role in Vera's death, while he decided whether to accept the deal. Miriam coached me on exactly what to say, how to express remorse without admitting to more than the plea required, how to acknowledge the family's loss while maintaining that I hadn't known about the medical equipment. I practiced reading the statement over and over in her conference room, But I never managed to get through it without breaking down when I reached the part about Vera being only 7 years old. The morning of the plea hearing arrived and my hands shook so bad I couldn't button my shirt properly. Gabriella had to help me get dressed in the conservative black suit Miriam said would make me look responsible. The courthouse steps seemed endless as we walked up them, and every person we passed felt like they were staring at me. Inside the courtroom, I saw Mrs. Antonoff sitting in the front row with several people who must have been family members. She looked older than I remembered, her face lined with grief. Miriam guided me to the defendant's table where we sat waiting for the judge to enter. When he finally came in, everyone stood and my knees almost gave out from nerves. The judge reviewed the case file for what felt like forever before asking if I understood the plea agreement. I managed to say yes, though my voice came out as barely a whisper. He asked me to state my plea to the charge of negligent endangerment. I stood up and said the words Miriam had coached me on, that I was entering a no-contest plea. The judge explained this meant I wasn't admitting guilt, but wasn't fighting the charges either. He asked if I understood and I nodded, unable to speak anymore. Ivy stood up next and started reading the factual basis into the official court record. She described in detail how I had unplugged the orange extension cord at 11:11 p.m. on that night. She explained how this action cut power to the medical equipment keeping Vera alive in the apartment above. She stated that 12 minutes later, when the backup battery died, Vera's ventilator stopped working. She said Vera suffocated in her sleep while her grandmother was in the bathroom, unable to hear the alarms. Each word felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest, making it harder to breathe. I stood there gripping the edge of the table so hard my knuckles turned white. The judge asked if I agreed with the facts as presented and I forced myself to nod. Then he called Mrs. Antonoff to give her victim impact statement. She walked slowly to the podium, clutching a piece of paper in her shaking hands. Her voice was thick with a Russian accent as she started talking about Vera. She described how her granddaughter loved to draw pictures of butterflies, even when she could barely hold the pencil. She talked about reading stories together every night, and how Vera always asked for one more chapter. She said they were so close to the lung transplant that would have saved her life. Just 6 more days and Vera would have gotten new lungs and a chance at a normal childhood. Then she looked directly at me and said she forgave me for what I did. But she could never forgive the system that failed to protect her granddaughter properly. She said a child's life shouldn't depend on an unmarked cord that anyone could unplug by accident. When she finished speaking and returned to her seat, half the courtroom was crying, including me. The judge asked if I wanted to make a statement, and Miriam nudged me to stand up. I unfolded the paper I'd practiced reading so many times and tried to steady my voice. I said I accepted responsibility for unplugging the cord that night to do my laundry. I explained that I was never told about its purpose or warned that it powered medical equipment. I said if I had known, I never would have touched it no matter how long I had to wait. I looked at Mrs. Antonoff and apologized directly to her, saying I would carry this guilt forever. I told her I wished every day that I could go back and undo what happened that night. My voice broke completely on the last sentence and I had to sit down. The judge took several minutes reviewing his notes before announcing his decision. He accepted the plea agreement and sentenced me to 2 years of probation as the prosecutor had recommended. He added 200 hours of community service to be completed within the first year. He also ordered me to pay $5,000 in fines, though he allowed a payment plan. He said the building's failures contributed significantly to this tragedy, but I still bore responsibility for not being more careful. He said a child died because of multiple system failures, including my own careless action. The gavel came down and just like that, I was officially a convicted criminal. 2 weeks passed in a blur of probation meetings and job applications that went nowhere. Then Miriam called to tell me Casper had his own day in court for the building violations. He pleaded guilty to multiple charges, including child endangerment and violation of electrical codes. The judge gave him fines and probation but no jail time, which felt like a joke considering what happened. The building got condemned, and all the tenants had to relocate within 30 days. Mrs. Delcroix and the others who'd screamed at me that night lost their homes too. It felt like hollow justice since nothing would bring Vera back. The harassment from former tenants gradually decreased over the next few weeks, though I still got occasional messages. Someone would text me "child killer" from a random number or leave angry voicemails. I finally changed my phone number and deleted all my social media accounts. Even with the new number, I'd sometimes get letters at Gabriella's address calling me a monster. My employer made their decision official a month after the plea hearing and terminated me formally. They said someone with my criminal record couldn't work with their clients anymore. Without income, I couldn't afford my apartment, even if I'd been allowed back there. I packed up what little I owned and moved into Gabriella's spare bedroom permanently. Every job application I filled out asked about criminal convictions, and I had to check, yes. Nobody wanted to hire someone whose name came up in news articles about a dead child. I started my community service at a medical equipment safety organization that Miriam had found for me. They knew my whole story, but agreed to let me help create warning labels and safety protocols. My first day there, I spent 8 hours designing stickers that said, "Critical medical equipment, do not unplug," in bright red letters. Working on preventing similar tragedies gave me a tiny sense of purpose through the crushing guilt. The organization's director introduced me to Raymond, who was their electrical safety consultant. We started developing a simple checklist system for landlords with medically fragile tenants who needed backup power. The checklist included proper labeling, multiple alarms, tenant notification procedures, and regular safety inspections. Several buildings in the city adopted our system within the first month. Knowing we might prevent another child from dying because of communication failures helped me sleep a little better at night, but I still woke up at 11:23 p.m. almost every night, the exact time Vera died. 3 weeks after the hearing, Detective McCoy called to say he had a box of my stuff from the old apartment. I met him at a coffee shop where he handed over a cardboard box with my kitchen items and some clothes. He sat down across from me and stirred his coffee for a long minute before speaking. "The system failed that kid," he said quietly. "Failed you too." I nodded, unable to find any words. He stood up and left without saying anything else, but his acknowledgement made something tight in my chest loosen just a little. The next day, Miriam called me to her office to go over the final paperwork for my case. She pulled out a folder thick with documents and started explaining the payment plan she'd worked out for her fees. I could pay her $50 a month for the next 3 years, which was all I could manage on unemployment. She closed the folder and looked at me directly. "I've defended real criminals. You're not one of them." Her words didn't erase the guilt, but they helped me breathe a little easier that night. Time moved strangely after that. Some days crawling, others flying past in a blur. 5 months after Vera died, I finally wrote the letter to Mrs. Antonoff that I'd been trying to write since the night of my arrest. I filled 3 pages with apologies and explanations, tore them up, and started over 4 times. The final version was just 1 page, saying how sorry I was and that I wished I could change what happened. I gave it to Miriam to send through her office since I couldn't contact the family directly. 2 weeks passed with no response, which I expected, but sending it felt like something I had to do. My 6-month probation check happened on a rainy Tuesday morning at the courthouse. The probation officer reviewed my file and checked that I was working temp jobs at a warehouse and a grocery store. She asked about my therapy sessions, and I told her I went every week to deal with the PTSD. The nightmares had gotten less frequent, but I still couldn't do laundry without checking every cord 3 times first. Sometimes I'd stand in laundromats for 20 minutes just staring at the outlets before I could plug anything in. She marked me compliant and scheduled my next check for 3 months later. That same week, I took the bus to a park on the other side of the city where nobody knew me. I'd saved up $400 from my temp jobs to contribute to a memorial bench for Vera. The parks department let me donate anonymously and include a small plaque that read, "In memory of Vera, always check medical equipment safety." It wasn't enough and never would be, but I needed to do something concrete in her memory. A week later, Gabriella showed me a news article on her phone about Casper's sentencing. He got $2,000 in fines and 18 months probation for the building code violations. No jail time, despite his negligence creating the whole dangerous situation. The article quoted him saying he was devastated by the tragedy and had done his best to help Vera. Reading his words made me so angry I threw up. But I was learning that justice and fairness weren't the same thing. I couldn't control what happened to him, only what I did moving forward. After crashing at Gabriella's for 6 months, I finally found a tiny studio apartment I could afford with my temp job income. Before moving in, I spent a whole day installing clear labels on every outlet and switch. I bought extra smoke detectors and carbon monoxide detectors with my first paycheck. I tested them every single month on the same date, marking it on my calendar in red pen. Living with this constant checking and rechecking was exhausting, but it was the only way I could function. My therapist called it hypervigilance and said it might ease up over time, but I couldn't imagine ever being casual about safety again. 7 months after that terrible night, the medical equipment safety organization where I'd been volunteering offered me a full-time position. They needed someone to help develop training materials for landlords and property managers about electrical safety for medical equipment. My supervisor knew my whole story since it had been in the news, but she said my experience could help save lives. I spent my days creating checklists and warning systems, writing protocols that spelled out exactly how to mark and protect critical medical circuits. Every label I designed, every safety protocol I wrote, I thought about Vera and how a simple red tag on that orange cord could have saved her life. The weight of her death would never leave me, but at least I was doing something to prevent the next tragedy.